Hello, today we're going to talk about Thomas Nagel's moral luck. This originally appeared in Moral Questions, but the version I teach in class is from The Moral Life, the Lewis Vaughan and Lewis Pogman anthology that has some very nice excerpts from moral questions that deal with moral luck as a response to Kant's deontological ethics. Especially, again, that emphasis on the intention of the act, whether or not the act is done from duty and for the sake of duty, and that is the only sort of relevant consideration when determining the moral worth of the action. That seems to be how Nagel understands Kant's theory. He quotes at the very beginning the selection from the grounding of the metaphysics of morals, where Kant says that the goodwill is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes, or because of its adequacy to achieve some proposed end. It is good only because of its willing, that is, it is good in and of itself. So the angle that moral luck takes on Kant, the basic question is, look, isn't it the case that we judge actions differently depending upon some elements that are not under the direct control of the agent? And aren't we justified to make judgments on those bases and modify our judgment on those bases? So what Nagel is asking us to do is to consider whether or not Kant is really demanding that what we are morally responsible for depends totally on something that's under our control. The will is under our control totally. It's the mechanism by which we control our own actions and effect in the world. So the moral worth of our action depends, it is dependent upon the will and what we intend and whether or not that aligns with duty, on something that's totally in our control. So things that are external to that are beyond our control, shouldn't, according to Kant, have any bearing on the moral worth of our actions. Nagel wants to push against that and say, well, we do actually adjust our moral judgments based upon things that are not in people's control. And actually we have good reasons to do that. And that's where moral luck is going to come in. So he outlines 4 types of moral luck. So there's one kind of moral luck that we're all very familiar with, which is just luck in the way one's actions and projects turn out. You're trying to do something, but you're not in control of every little detail of it, and so things turn out sometimes differently than you anticipated. We have a certain intention, an end that we would like to achieve. It just doesn't work out the way we want it to. Sometimes better than we expected, sometimes worse, but we are not always in control of other factors will affect how our action plans out. Other people intervening, the weather, if we want to plan an outside event, or technical difficulties if you're trying to organize a Zoom meeting or something, whatever the case may be, right? So factors that are external to your will that you don't have control over that affect how the project turns out. Then you have luck and how one is determined by antecedent circumstances. So the antecedent circumstances are just the conditions under which you're acting. What are the circumstances leading up to and the conditions that precede your action? And do they make it more or less favorable for you to be successful? So that idea of antecedent circumstances. What are the conditions leading up to your action? What's the situation from which you're acting? And how does that make it more or less likely that you will be successful in what you want to do? And doesn't that sometimes affect our moral judgments of people, right? That's the whole key with all of these different varieties of moral luck. So those have to do with the action and its outcome. Luck in the way one's action and project turns out, that's what we actually accomplish, sort of future looking at the situation and circumstances of our actions, and then how one is determined by antecedent circumstances, what comes before my action, whether or not the conditions are favorable to me being successful or not. The next two, constitutive luck and circumstantial luck, have a lot more to do with the agent themselves. It has to do with their makeup as a person. So constitutive luck, Nagel says, the kind of person you are, where this is not just a question of what you deliberately do, but of your inclinations, capacities, and temperament. So this is exactly where you can see him very explicitly contra Kant. He's asking us to consider specific and concrete aspects of a person's character, their tendencies, inclinations, capacities, temperaments, in whether or not we judge them to be morally praiseworthy. So that's a person's constitution. Whether or not they're quick to anger, or whether or not they are sort of meek and timid, or whether or not they have more likely to become addicted to a substance through continued use, or those sorts of things. Even stuff like, tall, short, those sorts of things. How they're constituted, their capacities. We might want to praise someone more if they've overcome some hardship or, adversity. If a person is really, really quick to anger, they're hot-headed, and yet they are able to rein that in and work against it in order to keep a cool, collected demeanor, we might praise them in a way that we wouldn't praise someone who's not a hothead, who's more timid in their behavior, because it's less difficult for them in some sense to keep their wits about them, so to speak. Then you have circumstantial luck. And circumstantial luck is, if the circumstances had been different, the judgment of your act would be assessed differently. So this is your actions relative to context. Like, if circumstances are different, we would judge you differently, and perhaps you would have done otherwise than you would have, that kind of thing. So again, Nagel's arguments really hinge upon that we make moral judgments based upon these elements of moral luck, and that we're justified in doing so. Kant, under the strict interpretation, seems to rule out those elements of moral luck as being morally relevant. They are irrelevant to our judgment. We should not, according to Kant, use those to judge actions, good or bad. Nagel thinks, no, we do in fact judge based on that, and we should sometimes. This is the difference between, for instance, like negligence. Negligence is not just about a person's intention. It's about their elements of moral luck, their constitution, how their circumstances affect it. He makes the distinction between manslaughter and negligence, or manslaughter and murder. He uses an example of these car accidents, right? Thinks about this truck driver who accidentally runs over the child. If the driver is entirely without fault, he will feel terrible about his role in the event, but he will not have to reproach himself. However, if the driver was guilty of even a minor degree of negligence, failing to have his brakes checked recently, for example, then if that negligence contributes to the death of the child, he will not merely feel terrible, he will blame himself for the death. And what makes this example of moral luck is that he would have to blame himself only slightly for the negligence itself if no situation arose which required him to brake suddenly and violently to avoid hitting the child. So this is about different levels of responsibility relative to the car. So consider that you might think of someone differently if they had done regular maintenance on their vehicle, and they take it to the shop when they should, put new brakes on it and everything like that. The situation arises where they suddenly have to brake because a kid runs out in the road. Some freak accident happens and their brakes fail. Nagel says that we would probably judge, and we would be right to judge that person less harshly because they had been doing everything It was truly out of their control. They had been keeping up on their truck, and this was a crazy accident that happened, and they shouldn't reproach themselves or feel bad, as if it's their fault, as if they're deeply morally responsible for this accident. However, if the person was negligent in the care of their vehicle, they never checked up on the brakes, they had neglected the vehicle, and so the brakes were old, they were perhaps prone to fail. It was likely, perhaps, because of their lack of care for the vehicle that the brakes would fail. In a situation where the child runs out and the brakes fail and the person kills them, we might hold them more responsible because they were negligent. Perhaps if they had taken better care of their car, it wouldn't have happened, rather than being a wholly freak sort of accident. So Nagel's asking us to consider these different levels of attention and how they affect our moral judgment. And they provide us with more of a spectrum of culpability. Someone is more or less responsible based upon these elements of moral luck. And he thinks it's true of what he calls higher levels. Again, there you can see that degree, higher levels of negligence. If someone has had too much to drink and his car swerves onto the sidewalk, he can count himself morally lucky if there are no pedestrians in his path. If there were, he would be to blame for their deaths, and would probably be prosecuted for manslaughter. But if he hurts no one, although his recklessness is exactly the same, he is guilty of a far less serious legal offense, and will certainly reproach himself and be reproached by others less severely. To take another legal example, the penalty for attempted murder is less than that for successful murder, however similar the intentions and motives of the assailant may be. Nagel seems to be arguing that Kant doesn't give us the grounds to make these finer moral distinctions, that the intention or the will of the people in these various scenarios is the same. The drunk driver who jumps up on the curb has the same will and intention as the one who jumps up on the curb, but there's also people there that they strike. The presence of people on the sidewalk in that scenario is a matter of moral luck relative to the drunk driver. Their will, in both instances, is the same. Whether or not there were people on the sidewalk is a matter of good or bad fortune, but it makes all the difference when we judge them. The person who jumps up on the curb with no people there is less guilty than the person who jumps up on the curb and there happens to be people there that they strike. And the same for murder. The intention of the murderer is the same, whether or not they're successful in carrying out the crime. And the Nagel seems to think that, well, if they're successful, that's worse. And actual accomplished murder is worse than attempted murder, even where the agent's intention is the same. Kant, on the other hand, seems to be thinking that if you're a murderer in your heart and you intend to murder somebody, that's as good as being an actual murderer that accomplishes the deed. Right? That seems to be Kant's position that Nagel is using moral luck to undermine there. The other thing that Nagel finds to be persuasive is that we can actually predict levels of moral culpability ahead of time on the basis of things about moral luck. And the example that he uses there is the baby in the bath. If you leave a child in the bathtub while you're drawing their bath water, and you go downstairs to get something, and you leave the child in the tub with the water running, Nagel thinks that you will understand ahead of time. You realize, oh no, I forgot the kid upstairs with the water running, and you bound up the stairs to make sure everything's okay. Nagel says, you know, as you're running up the stairs, that if the child is still in the tub okay, safe and sound, you're negligent. That's not good. But of course, that's far better than if you go up there and the child is drowned. Now, whether or not the child is drowned is a matter of moral luck. You did not intend for that to happen, but something could have happened outside of your control where the child drowns, or they don't. and you know that the outcome that you're not in control of will affect whether or not you've done something merely negligible or truly horrifying, right? You go up and the child's okay, you're negligent, that's one thing. You're not very good, really. You did something bad, but okay. You go up and the child's dead, that's terrible. Much worse than mere negligence. Just, oh, I forgot, right? Now, again, Nagel's saying that's not something in your control, but it's still something that affects how people judge your actions. And you understand this, like, intuitively. You have moral intuitions about this. Nagel, as an analytic philosopher, Nagel leans heavily on intuitions as evidence for the reasonableness of his position. So you understand intuitively how the outcome and the things outside of your control are going to bear on whether or not you're responsible for something truly horrible or just mere negligence or so on and so forth. He says, these are genuine moral judgments rather than expressions of a temporary attitude, as evident from the fact that one can say in advance how the moral verdict will depend on the results. And that's where he discusses the bathwater. So this is the basic idea of moral luck. And again, what Nagel is doing is using the idea of moral luck to undermine Kant's claim that what makes our actions morally praise or blameworthy is just what is in our control, strictly the will. Nagel's saying, no, we make moral judgments that are justifiable and that we should be making all the time based upon factors that aren't always in our control, and that's the element of moral luck. Now, at the very end of the essay, Nagel brings up, I think, an important problem, which is where do we draw the line between what people can control? How do we assess their actions? Given that they are involved in scenarios where what exactly they're in control of is kind of up for grabs. He talks about losing the person in the stream of events, submerging the person's actions in that causal stream of the sensual, to use some of Kant's language, such that it's difficult to attribute any action to them and their control. So where do we draw that line? Nagel sort of hand waves at that problem. That is beyond the scope of his paper or his treatment of moral luck anyway. But he does gesture to that as a moral problem. That problem, I think, is better addressed, for instance, by Christine Korsgaard. You can check out my video about creating the kingdom of ends, where Korsgaard discusses the problem of having to look at people from 2 points of view. One in which we treat them as moral agents and take seriously their first personal perspective as the author of their actions, versus the third person sort of impersonal point of view, where they're merely an object of sort of scientific inquiry. And of course, from that perspective, they'll always appear as merely one factor in the causal flow of events. I mean, that's just a result of the theoretical stance that we take toward them versus the practical one. So I think actually the problem that's raised by Nagel can be addressed, and if you're interested in that, you can check out that Christine Korsgaard article, Creating the Kingdom of Ends. She has a book-length study also called Creating the Kingdom of Ends that developed out of that journal article that I discussed in the other video. So that's the idea of moral luck. I think it raises some interesting questions for Kant and presents us with a pretty interesting avenue of attack against sort of strict deontological considerations, particularly when we have to put that ethical theory into practice, right? Nagel is correct that these factors that are attributable to moral luck feature prominently in the real world kinds of moral considerations that we make all the time. And we might ask whether or not it's really reasonable, which is a strong standard by Kant's own admission, for us to ignore all of that in favor of a purely formal judgment that's rendered from a position of like a pure rationality or something like that, right? So that's moral luck. Thank you for reading along with me, and I will see you in the next video.